of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon His beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.
wonderful story of love,
Tell it to me again.
wonderful story of love.
Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
Though you are far away,
Wonderful story of love.
still He doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
Jesus provides a rest
Wonderful story of love.
for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
to me again.
Wonderful story of love,
With the immortal strain.
Dealing with Abraham's story, which is chapter 12 all the way through chapter 25, and we are looking tonight, starting in verse 15 of chapter 22, after the obedience, after Abraham obeyed God, and what this text goes on to say. Then the angel of the Lord called Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. And so the young men there are the servants that came with him. You'll recall they left. He left with Isaac, with all the stuff for the altar and for the sacrifice. His servants came with him. They got to the mountain. He made them stay, and they went off and built the altar and was going to make the sacrifice. Well, he goes back and joins his servants. They go back home, is what that says. But in the middle of that is this proclamation that comes to him, this promise that is made to him. And this is the second time that this promise has been made. What's the significance about it being the second time? We wouldn't be reminded that it's the second time if it didn't matter. So what's the significance about it being the second time? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Okay. It's permanent. Any other thoughts? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Right. Anybody have any other thoughts? What do people repeat? When you tell somebody something more than one time. I'm sorry? You don't want them to forget, so the things that we repeat generally are what? The important stuff. That's what we do. And so this kind of underscores that God is making a point. If you will, it's been written and now it's been highlighted. If you go to a class, if you are in school or at the university, and the teacher says something 2 or 3 times in the lecture, can almost guarantee what? It's going to be on the test. You can almost guarantee it's going to be on the test. Why? Well, because he wouldn't repeat it or she wouldn't repeat it if it's not important and you don't need to remember it. And so that's, go ahead.
The 3 keys to teaching: repetition, repetition.
Yes. And so that's what's part of what's going on here. This is not a new promise. None of this is new. He said this before. He's letting them know. I told you this already. This is the second time. And then he says, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this. And what does he mean by myself? I have sworn. So he is making a promise, and he's making a promise by what?
He says this is his own authority.
Okay, that's good. Now keep your finger here because we're going to be back in just a second. But flip over to Hebrews 6 for just a minute. Hebrews chapter 6, we'll start reading about verse 13. We're looking at, I think, verse probably 15 or 16 or right around in there. But anyway, we'll start reading in verse 13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes An oath is final for confirmation, so when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that two unchangeable things which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast the hope we set before us. We do that all the time, right? We swear by something greater than ourselves. In courts of law, what do they want you to swear on? The Bible. Now, some people don't do that, but that's what they ask. When a president is sworn in, what does he swear on? A Bible. The idea is what? Why do they want you to do that? They want you to be honest. And so the idea is this: what? If you're willing to put your hand on the Bible, then somehow or another that is a more significant promise than you saying it yourself. We always want to swear by something greater than ourselves. You ever heard a child say, "I swear to God"? What are they trying to say? I'm absolutely serious about this. I'm being completely serious about this. I'm going to swear not by myself. I'm not just going to affirm it myself, but I'm telling you before God that this is what is true. What is greater than God? Nothing. So when we go back to this text again, notice he says, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord." There is no greater authority in which to base a promise. And he makes it clear. I want you to know that I'm being absolutely certain about this. And he says what? This is important language. Because you have done this thing. Now, there's a bookend to that. Move forward. Into verse 18. This promise ends with the words, "Because you have obeyed my voice." So the beginning of the promise and the end of the promise. Because you have done this, and because you have obeyed my voice. That makes clear the reason for God's blessing. Who does God bless? People who rebel against him? People who ignore him? Or those who listen to the voice of God and obey his voice? And that's set forth from the very beginning. When Adam and Eve obeyed the voice of God, they dwelled in fellowship with God in the garden of God and ate freely of the tree of life. When they rebelled against God and refused to obey the voice of God, what happened? They were expelled from the garden and lost access to the tree of life. They were afraid of God. They were ashamed and hid from God. All of that changed when they didn't listen to the voice of God and didn't obey God. But because you have obeyed my voice, God says, you've not withheld your son, your only son. And I think we've talked about that in previous chapters. Obviously, Isaac wasn't, in an absolute sense, his only son. Isaac was his only son from Sarah and his only son that God had promised him. Ishmael was not the son that God had promised. Ishmael was not brought about the way that God wanted. In fact, Ishmael was brought about how? From them not trusting God. And we talked about that a lot back when we read that story. But, I mean, listen, they were waiting a long time and they were getting old and they were beginning to doubt. And they were trying to help God. But God doesn't need our help. He just needs us to do what? Obey his voice. And so finally, as an old man, he finally gets this promised son, and now the son is a lad, and God says, offer him as a sacrifice. Now, this is a son that he has already promised him through Isaac. You're going to be this great nation, and all the world's going to be blessed through Isaac. And even at that point, you'll recall that Abraham tried to negotiate with God a little bit and said, well, yeah, but what about Ishmael? And God said, I told you it's going to be through a son from Sarah. That's the son that I promised. That's the son that I'm going to do this and fulfill this promise through. But I've heard you, and I will bless Ishmael as well. But here's this son that God has promised to make him a great and mighty nation from, and that's going to bring blessing to the world. And God says, sacrifice him. And Abraham did not refuse. We have seen a development and a growth of faith in Abraham, a completion of Abraham's faith, if you will, borrowing from the language of James 2, a perfection of his faith. We know from Hebrews 11 that Abraham believed that if it was necessary, God would do what? Raise him from the dead. If that's what God needed to do in order to fulfill his promise, Abraham believed that God would fulfill his promise, whatever God had to do in order to do it. And that's what true faith in the promises of God looks like. And so because you have not withheld this son that I promised you, your only son, the son of promise, indeed, I'll greatly bless you. I'll greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and the sand on which is on the seashore. Your seed shall possess the gate of your enemies. What does that mean, shall possess the gate of your enemies? Okay. Okay. What do the gates represent?
The security of the fence around.
Okay, so there's a wall around the city. We know how cities were built at that time, right? Protected cities had walls around them. And the gate of the city was where you gained entrance or not, where you were repelled if you were not allowed to come in. And so whoever controls the gate controls the city. They control who goes in, who goes out. If an enemy should come around and actually come to possess your gates, what do we call that?
Invasion.
Okay, but if they don't enter the city, if they just blockade you in, what happened over time? There's a lot of cities that were destroyed that way. They starved to death. That's exactly right. They could stop food from getting in and all the necessities of life. And they would just encamp around the city and wait and win the war by attrition. If you control the gate, you control that's what he's saying. You will control the gate of your enemies. In other words, you have the upper hand. You're going to have the upper hand. Now, does that mean forever? Well, obviously not. At least not in temporal terms. Because at various times, Israel didn't control even their own gates. In fact, if you'll remember in Nehemiah's time, the walls of Jerusalem had been completely torn down and lay in ruins until Nehemiah got permission from the king of Persia to go back and rebuild them. So there were times not only that they didn't control their enemy's gate, they didn't even control their own. And in fact, when Jesus himself made his appearance in the world, who controlled Jerusalem? Rome. And so clearly this isn't a promise about absolute dominance in temporal terms. I don't think any of this is specifically about the temporal blessings. I do think that they did become a powerful nation. I do think that the land promise was connected to Israel and various, but I think this is talking about the spiritual descendants of Abraham. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Not just one. Because you have obeyed my voice. In other words, what was Abraham doing? Abraham was carrying out the plan of God. This is God's stamp on the faithfulness of Abraham and on the effect of the faithfulness of man and on the fact that this is part of how God is going to redeem men from all nations. This seed is argued in the New Testament that he did not say to your seeds, plural, but said to and in your seed, all nations will be blessed. And we're told that that seed refers to who? The Christ. So what we have unfolding here is the explanation about what God is doing to redeem man and giving us the tools to identify the one who would redeem man. We now know that a descendant of Abraham is going to be the seed through whom all nations are blessed. And we know that in order to be a part of that blessed people, we have to have faith like Abraham had. And that faith is described on both ends of this promise as because you have done this thing and because you have obeyed my voice. You want to be among the blessed, then you obey the voice of God. You do what God tells you to do. Now, we talked about the fact that in Abraham's sacrifice, we were shown that the attitude of heart, that the spirit within the man, that the desire to walk with God and to have confidence in the promises of God is superior to the temporal things. But that does not mean that obedience is not required. That means that obedience is required by faith. That doing the thing is not what makes it right. That doing the thing because God has said is what makes it right. Does that make sense? Everybody understand what the distinguishing characteristic that I'm making? In other words, if I'm nice to somebody because I want to get something from them, does that please God? If I'm nice to someone because I love them, because they're created in the image of God, and God has said, love your neighbor as yourself, does that please God? Might I still get some kind of temporal benefit from it? Yeah, I might. But the question is what my true motive is. By the way, who knows that motive? As far as I know, there are two people that know that motive.
Maybe you.
Maybe me and God. And so we have to think about that. It's not enough just to assemble with the saints. We know Hebrews 10 says not to forsake the assembling of yourselves together. Okay, we know that. But it's not enough just to be in the assembly. You have to love God. You have to have a heart to worship. You have to consider the people around you, because don't forget Hebrews 10:24, before it says not to forsake the assembly of yourselves together, says to consider one another, to stimulate one another to loving good deeds. I have to not only be here, but I have to be here for the right cause, with the right heart, and doing it all because I seek to honor God and obey his voice. So to reject the voice of God and to not do it is a problem. But to just go through the motions is also a problem, which is why by the time that the prophet Malachi came along, God through Malachi said, I wish someone was there to just put chains on the door, to lock the doors and keep you from going in and uselessly kindling fire on my altar. They were still going through the routine of worship, but their heart was far from God. And so the act of worship was empty because they lacked this attitude of love that Abraham demonstrated, this measure of faith that Abraham demonstrated. And so we need to keep that in mind. It is a false narrative that says that you don't have to do and keep the commandments of God.
Seems like a growing thing.
It is.
I'm living in.
It doesn't matter as long as you accept God as your personal Savior. Then
I was talking to a guy about this on local issues, and his answer to some blatantly not Bible practice was, well, that's what grace is for.
and that is not what grace is for.
Intentionally sin, by the way, next time you will be doing this wrong thing, and God's covering it by grace.
No, that's not the way it works. Listen, I start off lost. Salvation is possible because of what God has done, and my awareness of the possibility of salvation is only made to me because of what? Because God has spoken. If God had not told us and demonstrated to us and made us aware of all that he was doing and helped us see what he was accomplishing in the Christ, I'd stay lost. The grace is extended to me by my faithful obedience to God, which is why Titus writes and says, the grace of God has appeared, teaching us to deny ungodliness and worldly desires and to live righteously and sensibly in the present age. That the whole process that comes about through coming to understand what God has done for us and what we need to do in response to it and obeying his voice, that is the grace of God being extended to me. It's not freedom to do whatever I want to do. By the way, Paul even dealt with that in the Roman letter too, right? After he gives this big chapter on the importance of grace and what grace does, he opens up chapter 6 saying what? Should we continue in sin that grace may increase? And he said what? God forbid. How can we who died to sin still live in it? We have to obey the voice of God. That's what it means to have faith like Abraham, to be the children of Abraham, to be the seed of promise, or to be the heirs of the seed of promise. We become heirs of Abraham by faith, is what's taught, when we have his faith. And his faith is very clearly set forth here as being his obedience to the things that God asked him to do. By the way, it even started before this particular event, right? He left his homeland in Ur, not knowing where he was going. Why did he leave? Because God asked him to leave. He went to the places that God told him to go. He went to Haran first. He went to Canaan. He went to Egypt. He went back to Canaan. He went where God told him to go. He did what God told him to do. He was waiting. He had a few weaknesses that revealed themselves in the process. He worked through them. His faith was perfected, and that was shown fully in this proof of what he did when he was asked to offer his son Isaac. You did not withhold the son that I promised you. Therefore, the blessing is yours, and the blessing is to all those who have a faith like that. All right. So Abraham returned. He goes back. He lives in Beersheba. Verse 20. It came about after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Now, we're not going to take the whole time to develop this out, but go home and do some searching. You're going to find out Milcah, where she's from, and the connection to the story. Nahor is one of Abraham's brothers. Okay? Milcah is his wife, and Milcah has borne children to Nahor. Uz, his firstborn, Buz, his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, and Hazo, and Pildash, and Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. These 8 milk aborted Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also bore Terah and Gaham and Tahash, and I'm not even going to, Makkah, I think is how you say that name. I hate those 2 A names. I really do. Why do we care about who Nabor's children are? I'm sorry? They do. They lead to the lineage of Jesus. They're part of the story because this story is about how he brings the seed into the world. And these children that he just named are part of that. Nabor's son Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Now, Rebekah is going to show up in the story in a couple of chapters as who? Go back one generation. Isaac's wife. Rebekah is Abraham's son, Isaac, the one that he just had been asked to. Rebekah is going to be his wife, and it's through Isaac and Rebekah that the lineage that brings Jesus into the world is going to come.
I think Jacob married Rachel
And Leah. It was, right, I understand. Rebekah's going to grow up, and the servant of Abraham's going to be sent back and looking for a wife, and Rebekah's going to show up and water the camels of the servant. The servant's going to go make a deal and bring her back to be Isaac's wife. We'll read that in a couple of chapters. So this is still part of the explanation, still part of the story about how Jesus came into the world. Now, real quick note. It's just interesting. How many sons are named from Nahor? 12. How many sons did Abraham have?
I know you got
Yeah.
2 over there, but you sent me back to the drawing board because I said we don't know. And the answer is after Sarah died, he marries. They named the concubine. They named numerous sons.
Right.
Then he marries other concubines, and he sends those sons away.
Gets kind of crazy.
But he's named more than 2 names.
But at this point, he's got 2 sons.
When Sarah died.
Yeah, at this point, he's got 2 sons, and his brother's got 12. Now, remember, the promise to Abraham was what? I'm going to make you a great nation. How hard would it be to believe that when all I have is one child? That is a child of promise, and that is a legitimate child. The other child was not even born to my wife, and she's been sent away with the child. He's not even here anymore. So I've really got 1 son, and my brother's got 12. And I'm going to be the great nation? Just kind of interesting. I'll also mention this. Ishmael, how many sons did he have? We talked about this.
12.
He had 12. Genesis 25 will make that clear. How many sons did Jacob have? 12. But here's Abraham, the man that's told you're going to be this great nation, and he's got 1 son. What difference does it make? Right. Faith. Exactly. Faith. When Abraham sees this, when Abraham hears this, when Abraham learns of the big families were important, and he had waited all this time, he's got this 1 heir. Does he still believe the promise of God? And the answer is yes. And he builds his life around believing that promise of God. Even when it looks like things are not unfolding the way that God has promised, is God still fulfilling his promises? Yes. Did Abraham become the father of a great nation? Yes. Just exactly the way God promised. But it didn't look that way at that point in time. Just didn't look like it. But it was still happening just the way God desired it to happen. We have to stop. Yes.
One more thing, but then again, looking at people picture God.
Yep.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea.